Hello, fourth grade. Today we're going to be working on lesson 2 of chapter 4, talking about the Southeast region of the United States. For lesson 2, we're working on what made the Southeast grow during the 1700s. And in this lesson, we're going to be talking a lot about cause and effect of different things that caused the Southeast to grow in the 1700s. And so, yes, you're going to be using your investigative skills to identify causes for the growth of the Southeast. And then you're going to be talking and reading about different ways and different reasons for why that happened. And then later on, you're going to be writing about it as well. And so here we have our photo, the historic Capitol building in Williamsburg, Virginia. Let's go ahead and start our reading. Before we begin, make sure that you check the inspect portion. So inspect, read, look at the title. What does the word revolutionary mean for you? And then, of course, circle the words and phrases that you don't know. If you have any questions about the words, you can go ahead and use your resources to try to find out what they mean, or you can leave me a comment in Google Classroom. Underline clues that help you answer the questions who, what, when, where, or why. These are all of your asking questions. Then highlight important words that tell you what happened, what caused something to happen. So think of while you're reading, did this cause something else to happen? Was this the reason why something else happened? And then we can go ahead and begin reading. Once you're done, you're going to be rereading what did many of the Virginia representatives want to do about the conflict with the British. So after you're done, go back over and check and see if there's anything in there that talks about how they wanted to deal with the British. What was the purpose of Patrick Henry's speech? What words did he use to let you know its purpose? And then underline the events or dates leading up to the Revolutionary War. In your opinion, what role did Patrick Henry play in the American Revolution? Okay, so we're starting from the beginning. Revolutionary ideas.
During the 1770s, Virginia was one of the colonies ruled by the British government. British laws required colonists to pay steep taxes. Many Americans felt these laws were unfair. Many colonists thought they should be able to govern themselves. Protests had already begun in the Northeast. In March 1775, representatives met in Richmond, Virginia, to discuss what to do. These men, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were elected to represent the main settlements of Virginia. Many of the representatives talked about waiting to ask the British to reduce taxes. After days of debate, a man named Patrick Henry spoke to the representatives. Henry's passionate speech described the British acts of war already happening in the Northeast. He rallied the men to see themselves as Americans, not just as Virginians. Henry's famous line, "Give me liberty or give me death," was an important moment. The representatives voted to organize soldiers to fight the British. George Washington was later chosen to lead the Continental Army, which won the Revolutionary War.
And so here we have a drawing or a piece of art at least. And so we have our caption. Patrick Henry delivered his Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech in Richmond, Virginia on March 23rd, 1775. And so we're now going to look at a primary source. So these are his exact words. In their words, Patrick Henry, our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to purchase it at the price of chains and slavery? God, or forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And this is from a speech given to the Virginia Convention in Richmond, Virginia, March 23rd, 1775. And so here it was talking about, actually, it was here. They wanted you to underline the events or dates leading up to the Revolutionary War. And in your opinion, what role did Patrick Henry play in the American Revolution? You can go ahead and write your answer here. So why do you think that this speech would have been important if, now that you know that during the 1770s, Virginia was one of the colonies ruled by the British government, and then over time, they started to revolt against them? Why do you think that his speech with the famous words, "Give me liberty or give me death," would be important? On Google Classroom, you're also going to have another source that you can use, but only after you've completed your pages. So now explore cause and effects. So here we have what a cause is and then what an effect is. We've talked about it before, but in case you're unfamiliar or in case you forgot, when we talk about cause and effect, we're saying a cause is why something happens and an effect is the result of what happened. An event can be either a cause or an effect. So if, for example, because of this speech, people started to volunteer to fight against the British, that would be a cause and an effect. But if this speech was the result of the British oppressing the American revolutionaries, then the speech would have been an effect. It depends on what came first and what you're focusing on. And so the first way to find the causes and effects, you need to read the text all the way through to help you understand what the text is about. Then you need to look for words and phrases that signal. So think of it like clues that tell you cause and effect relationships. Words like cause, effect, because, so, and due to. Then you need to identify events that are linked to the signal word. So you need to see what is around those words that are connected to what happened after that. So look for clues in the text that indicate which events caused a change and which events were the effect. Be aware that a cause can have more than one effect, and an effect can have more than one cause. It doesn't have to be one to one. It doesn't have that one thing cause one other thing. No, it can have one thing that caused three other things, five other things. Um, for example, if you want to talk about how when they gave this speech, and because of the British uh, being responsible for a lot of different issues in the United States at the time, it ended up causing the Revolutionary War. And now here we are hundreds of years later, where we have so many different effects due to that original cause. So based on the text you read below, you're going to be filling in this cause and effect. And so thinking about what we just read about on the other pages, what were some of causes, or what could be a cause that you could list there? What was one of the main things that they were talking about on the other page? What was one of the questions that they were talking about? Who were they focusing on? On the other page, we talked about Patrick Henry and how he gave a speech to the Virginia Convention, rallying them to join the revolution. And then, because of what he said, colonists from Virginia joined the Revolutionary War and helped the colonies fight for their independence. So, because of Patrick Henry's speech, there were people who joined, there were people who started to believe in the Revolutionary War or started to believe that they should fight back. And so the effect was that colonists from Virginia joined the Revolutionary War. And so that could be one of the causes and effects that you saw from the past couple of pages. And so now we're going to start reading pages 134 to 43. And so we're going to be looking for different causes, so different things that had effects on other things. And then once you're done with that, so while we're reading, you can go ahead and start filling these in. And then once you're done with that, you're going to be writing about one main key cause and effect. Choose one of the causes that you think most influenced the growth of the Southeast, then write a paragraph below describing how this cause affected the Southeast in the 1700s. So you're going to choose one of the ones that you took guided notes on the previous page to write about here. Then you're going to pull it together with think about the growth of the Southeast in the 1700s. How did the events and decisions of the time change the Southeast? How was it that things that happened during that time period changed the way that the Southeast looked, the way that it functioned, the way that it worked? So let's go ahead and go through our textbook pages. So we're on page 134 in our textbook. What made the Southeast grow during the 1700s is our title for lesson 2. And our first subtitle, the first English settlers. And here we have a timeline where it says 1607, the first settlers arrived in Jamestown. In 1693, the College of William and Mary opened. Then we have 1732. Georgia is founded as the last of the 13 British North American colonies. And 1783, the British surrender at Yorktown. 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And here we have the caption for our painting. English colonists established James Fort at Jamestown in Virginia. So let's go ahead and begin reading. The first English settlers.
Early attempts by the English to colonize North America took place in what is now North Carolina. English colonists tried to settle at Roanoke 3 times in the late 1580s. They had conflicts with Native Americans and food shortages. The Roanoke settlement failed and the people vanished in 1590. Despite the failures, the English tried again. This time they landed in Chesapeake Bay. Jamestown was established in 1607 along the banks of the James River in Virginia. Early settlers struggled to survive, but local Native Americans helped them find food and live off the land. In the years that followed, more English settlers flooded Virginia. Jamestown became a permanent English settlement. The colonists originally searched for gold but didn't find any. They quickly discovered that the climate and geography of Virginia were ideal for farming. The crop that led to the success of the Virginia colony was tobacco. Colonists could sell tobacco to Europeans for needed supplies. To make more money and keep up with demand, tobacco farmers needed a large number of workers. At first, they brought indentured servants from England. Indentured servants were people who worked for a promised number of years to pay for passage to the colony. But, then in the early 1600s, English and Dutch traders brought enslaved Africans to work on plantations. By 1650, there were 300 enslaved Africans working in Virginia.
And so from the very beginning of the United States history, they had slaves brought so that way they could help with so they could use them so that way they could create more land, or they could use more land so that way they could have plantations and for other labor. So from the very beginning of the United States um, being created. Let's go ahead and continue. Colonial government in Virginia.
The Virginia colony was started because King James I of England allowed the Virginia Company from London to colonize part of America. The Southeast at the time was rural. Most people lived miles away from neighbors. Plantation farming of tobacco was the primary source of wealth. As the Virginia colony grew and became successful, the need for government grew. The king appointed governors to carry out his wishes in the colonies. To improve relations with the Virginia colony, the king allowed the people to manage some of their own problems. So, in 1619, the House of Burgesses was organized in Virginia. It was the first elected government in America. Representatives from different plantations met in the House of Burgesses and decided on laws. They met in Jamestown, the location of the first settlement. The House of Burgesses gave early colonists a role in governing themselves. The King of England became troubled by colonists having too much power and by raids by Native Americans. So, he declared Virginia as a royal colony in 1624, taking control from the Virginia Company. Even though it was limited, the House of Burgesses system remained in effect in Virginia up until the Revolution. As the colony grew, it became more convenient to relocate Virginia's capital to Middle Plantation further inland. With permission from the king, Middle Plantation was renamed Williamsburg in 1699. Williamsburg was one of the first planned cities in America.
And so from here and the other page, we already have seen some different causes and some different effects of the first European settlers or the first English settlers arriving. We saw that when they arrived, there were a couple of different effects, some of them being that Native Americans sometimes allowed them, sometimes did not allow them. And as a result, different settlers sometimes survived, sometimes they died. And then because the English settlers were not by themselves, they brought slaves over as well. So they brought the first African slaves over when they first arrived in the 1700s, or sorry, the 1600s. So those are some different causes and effects. We also saw that the king did not like the amount of power that the Virginia colonies had, or technically the Virginia company had. And then from there, what was the result of that? Well, he changed the rules so that way the company would have less control. But even after he changed the rules, because there weren't as many people following them, they were still in power. Let's continue with Revolution and Independence. And here we have, our caption being the Governor's Palace in Williamsburg, Virginia. And here, Thomas Jefferson wrote much of the Declaration of Independence. For this caption, actually, let me see if I can zoom it in a little bit. very clear. It looks like we've got George Washington and soldiers against the British. Oh, actually, no. Not George Washington. British General Cornwallis surrendered to the American General George Washington at Yorktown, Virginia on October 19th, 1781. So I assume that's who we have here. And they have their white flag, as in they're saying that they surrender, and here we have the American flag on the other side. At the time, the American flag was just a circle with 13 stars, because there were only 13 colonies, and so those were the original 13 states in the Southeast. Let's go ahead and continue reading.
The British government imposed taxes on the colonists to pay for its war debts. Between 1763 and 1775, harsh taxes and laws restricted trade in the colonies. This greatly impacted Virginia, the wealthiest of the 13 colonies. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses organized a committee to protest the steep taxes. The governor, who was loyal to the king, tried to break up the House of Burgesses in 1774. Members continued to meet and tried to get the British to change their laws over the colonies. Patrick Henry gave a passionate speech that influenced Virginia to join the American Revolution. The Revolutionary War began when fighting broke out against the British in 1775. Delegates from the 13 colonies assembled and moved toward independence. Thomas Jefferson, a Virginian, wrote much of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. This document announced that the American colonies were free to form their own nation. The Revolutionary War ended when the Continental Army defeated the British on October 19, 1781, in Yorktown, Virginia.
And so here we have more information about the Revolutionary War and America's fight for independence and who was involved with it. And we can see how Patrick Henry was an important person in the Revolutionary War, but not necessarily through just fighting. He also inspired people to join and to fight back. So we can see that the British government, by their imposing taxes on the colonists to pay for the debts, this is due to the Indian War, this is due to a couple of different wars that were happening at the time. The colonists did not like that the taxes were being raised, and they didn't like that they had less control, especially the ones who were the wealthiest. These were the ones being most impacted. And so because of that, they decided to protest. Because of that, they decided to make speeches, fight back. And then if you've ever heard the phrase, no taxation without representation, this is another example of it. They did not like that they were being spoken for without their own actual say in it. And so now we're going to go ahead and continue to a growing region.
By the time the colonies won their independence from the British, the Southeast had more than 1 million people. The agriculture of the Southeast made landowners some of the wealthiest people in the country. Settlers rushed to claim land, seeking opportunities for freedom and wealth. Expanding west, the Appalachian Mountains formed a geographic barrier for settlers. By the middle of the 1700s, the Piedmont region from the Atlantic coast to the Appalachians had been explored and settled. Rivers made it possible to transport people and goods in the region, but travel further west was stopped. In 1775, Daniel Boone led an expedition to find a way through the Appalachians and into the West. He uncovered a Native American trail through the Cumberland Gap in Virginia. His discovery opened territories in Kentucky and Tennessee. Settlers came from Scotland, Ireland, and Germany to settle the American frontier. These Appalachian settlements did not develop the cash crop economy found east of the mountains. By the 1780s, enslaved people made up about 40% of the population of the Southeast. Plantation owners in the Southeast used enslaved people to do labor. As settlers moved west, they took their enslaved people with them. Not all African Americans were enslaved. Some escaped or bought their freedom and looked for places to start their lives as free men and women.
And here we have the caption, Daniel Boone led settlers through the Cumberland Gap. And so we have our painting down here. Oh, it's not expanding. All right. And then we saw some different effects of the region growing. The population grew, and so they needed more land. Um, but the question is, where did they take the land from? Because it's not that the land was appearing out of nowhere. There were people on these land already. And so, or on this land. And so, well, the question that they're not mentioning here is what happened to the people that were there if the European settlers started to move westwards? And what happened to the enslaved people there? Well, we saw that a side effect of or a cause of European settlers coming is that they brought slaves with them, right? And then because of that, they needed more slaves as they started to grow and as they started to make money off of their labor. Let's go ahead and continue with diverse population.
After the colonies won their independence from the British, areas in the southeast were still controlled by other European countries. For example, the Spanish had settlements in Florida. Regional cultures developed from the mixing of people in different territories. Louisiana was claimed by both France and Spain at different times. A group called Creoles lived near New Orleans. The Creole culture developed from a blend of the region's French, Spanish, and African peoples. In South Carolina and Georgia, people called the Gullah had their own regional culture. Most of the Gullah people were from Sierra Leone in Africa. Europeans enslaved and brought the Gullah to the southeast to work on plantations. The Atlantic coastal plain where they settled was isolated from the rest of the region. This allowed the Gullah people to retain much of their African culture and language. Native American groups also lived and traded throughout the southeast. The Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole nations sometimes fought settlers moving into their lands. However, they also worked and traded together. Frontier settlers often adopted ways of living from the Native American groups.
Let's go ahead and read our caption. St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest settled city in the United States, was founded by the Spanish in 1565. So this is before the British arrived, and this is also um, when the British still hadn't claimed Virginia yet. We are now on page 140, Development of Agriculture.
The fertile soil and long growing season made the southeast ideal for growing crops. Agriculture was the main industry during the 1700s. Plantation farming cash crops were grown on huge farms called plantations. A single plantation could be more than 1,000 acres in size and have hundreds of people working on it. In the 1700s, the work was done by enslaved Africans. Tobacco was the first cash crop grown on plantations. By the 1700s, tobacco plantations were found across Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. The wetlands of South Carolina and Georgia were used for rice plantations. The enslaved Gullah people knew how to make rice grow in the marshes. Indigo, used for its expensive blue dye, was also grown in South Carolina. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793. The cotton gin was a machine that separated cotton fibers from its seeds much faster than could be done by hand. Use of the cotton gin allowed plantation owners to keep up with the high demand for cotton from textile factories in the Northeast and Europe. By 1803, cotton was the leading cash crop in the United States. To grow more cotton, plantation owners used more enslaved people and took more land from Native Americans.
So here they mentioned that they took more land, and here they mentioned that they had to have more slaves um, in order to keep up with the demands for their economy that they had established at the time. And so one of the ways that they did that was by creating machines that could do things faster than humans. So processing cotton was made faster by Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which helped separate the seeds between the cotton balls, which you might see right here. So these are cotton plants. And so after the flowers grow, right here, these cotton balls, inside of them are little seeds. And so they needed to be separated in order to find the seeds, and then they could start being used for material. So here, cotton grown in the southeast was used to make textiles in northeast mills. So they grew the fabric, or they grew the plant in the south, and then they would export it to the north, and that's where a lot of factories ended up being. And that's where a lot of the Industrial Revolution happened as well. Let's continue reading on slavery and the Southeast economy. And here we have growing tobacco helped the Jamestown settlement survive.
Plantation farming and the wealth generated by plantations would not have been possible without the huge number of enslaved people who planted and harvested the crops. The unjust and cruel system of slavery began in the American colonies in 1619 when more than 20 enslaved Africans were brought to Jamestown. By the 1790s, more than half the people living in Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas were enslaved and working on plantations. Small farms. Even though there were many plantations in the Southeast, most of the land in the region was owned by yeoman farmers. Yeomen owned small areas of land and worked on the farms with their families. These small farms produced grains, fruits, and vegetables. The food and livestock were used by the families and sold locally. Small yeoman farms had few or no enslaved people, but many yeoman farmers still supported slavery. Yeomen represented the largest group of farmers. In the mid-1700s, colonies such as Virginia offered land grants to encourage people to settle new territories. The frontier land near the Appalachian Mountains was mostly settled by poor European farmers who immigrated to America. Many started as indentured servants who moved west when their contracts were paid. Frontier farmers were isolated, and they only grew what they needed to live.
And here we have the photo talking about the tobacco. So here we have tobacco plants and tobacco plantations. Now we don't necessarily use tobacco as much, but back then it is a very addictive plant that people smoke. And then at the time, it was very high in demand. And so they would grow it there and export it elsewhere. Let's continue to transportation.
In the 1700s, transportation in the Southeast was difficult and dangerous. There were very few roads. Therefore, the most reliable way to travel was by boat. Waterways connected the vast rural landscape of the Southeast with other colonies. Farmers shipped crops down rivers to market. Ships then carried goods to Europe and the Caribbean to sell. British colonists settled in South Carolina in 1670. They named their settlement Charlestown, which was later shortened to Charleston. By 1740, the port at Charleston was the busiest in the Southeast. It was critical to the plantations of Virginia and the Carolinas, shipping tobacco, rice, lumber, and cotton for trade. New Orleans was the major port city of the French territory of Louisiana. It was controlled by Spain from 1763 to 1802. New Orleans is located where the Mississippi River flows into the Gulf of Mexico. The port was a vital trade center for people transporting goods to and from the Mississippi Valley.
And here we have then and now. New Orleans grew as a port in the 1700s and 1800s because of its location at the mouth of the Mississippi River. I'll see if I can show you a map to show you exactly where New Orleans is. It's right next to Texas, but it's also where Hurricane Katrina hit. Today, New Orleans is an important trade center in the Southeast. So this is what it looks like now versus before. Let's continue on the next page. We're still continuing with the topic of transportation.
Images. The invention of the steamship in 1787 further boosted the economy of the Southeast. Steamships were large boats that used steam engines to power through the water. They could sail up and down rivers quickly, carrying huge loads of goods and people. Before steamships, flat-bottomed barges were used to carry goods down rivers. They were not able to sail back up rivers. Steamships allowed plantation owners to move cash crops to port cities in a matter of days. They also connected the region's waterways for people to travel more easily. Steamships on the Mississippi River carried settlers into the Mississippi Territory. In 1795, the United States and Spain signed Pinckney's Treaty. This treaty allowed Americans to travel freely up the Mississippi River. It also gave American merchants a permanent place in the port of New Orleans to bring goods to be exported. Steamships ruled the Mississippi River in the 1800s. They provided a fast and comfortable way to travel. By 1811, steamships could freely travel from Ohio all the way to the port of New Orleans.
And so here we have our caption for our painting. And this is what a steamship used to look like. Yes, it would have your turbines to push it along. And then, of course, inside there would be the captain and so on, being powered by steam engine. So they had to use coal or some sort of fuel source in order to heat water in order to push those turbines to push the boats. And so steamships contributed to the growth of trade and transportation on the Mississippi River. And so that is the end of our reading. Let's go ahead and fill in our causes and effects. So as we were reading, you should have been filling this in for any causes and effects that you noticed. Some of them could have been how Jamestown colonies started in Virginia, and it was a plantation to grow tobacco. And maybe an effect of that is that the colony needed more laborers, so they brought indentured servants and they brought over enslaved Africans, and then they made them do the work for the tobacco plantations. If you wanted to talk about how the British imposed harsh taxes and trade laws on the colonists, well, what happened as a result of that? Well, we saw that the colonists declared independence from Britain, and then they fought in the Revolutionary War in order to separate themselves. Maybe you wanted to talk about how Daniel Boone uncovered a Native American trail through the Cumberland Gap, and then settlers used the gap to travel through the Appalachian Mountains and settle into more of the Southeast. If you want to talk about how as more European settlers arrived, more land was taken from Native Americans. All of those are different causes and different effects. If you want to talk about how as more European settlers arrived and maybe they had more land and they were making more money off of different plantations, they brought more enslaved people over as well. The population grew, but that means also that the enslaved population grew. Or if you want to talk about how Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, then, well, what happened as a result of that? Cotton started to get processed faster. Plantation owners grew more cotton to keep up with the demand from textile mills in the north. And then the demand for enslaved workers increased because they needed more cotton and they needed more people to pick the cotton. They couldn't just have it appear out of nowhere. They had to plant it. Or if you wanted to talk about how steamships arrived in the southeast, people could travel and ship crops more easily on the region's rivers and waterways. Because unlike land, water is another resource that you can use in order to help you travel. Once you're done with that, we can go ahead and work on the next page. So here we needed to think about causes and effects. And so you need to choose one cause and effect about how what you think influenced the growth of the Southeast. If you wanted to talk about how settlers wanted to make money with crops, with resources like cotton, like vegetables, like fruits, all of those different things, plantations, then maybe you could talk about how this caused Africans to become more, or there needed to be, they needed to capture more Africans in order to force them to do the work for it because they weren't doing it themselves. And there wasn't a high population at the time, but that was a way that they made, that was a cause and an effect for the region. What ended up happening? Well, more people started to live there, more people started to buy land there, so that way they could also make money off of it. Maybe you want to talk about how they used their own wealth to help the population grow. Maybe you want to talk about how voting at the time was restricted to only people who had, or people of European descent at the time for the Revolutionary War. Maybe you want to talk about how when King James decided to tax them, that might have been the most important thing that caused everything else. But again, this is all, you need to choose one of your things that you mentioned in your graphic organizer and then write about it, at least 4 sentences with your different cause and effects. Then after that, you're going to be answering, talking about the growth of the Southeast in the 1700s. How did the events and decisions of the time change the Southeast? Well, so you saw there were lots of different causes and effects of different things, But what do you think made the Southeast officially change? Do you think that it was the Europeans that arrived? Do you think that it was the businesses that decided to start there? Do you think that it was the British? Do you think that it was the Europeans? So it could be the French, it could be the Spanish, it could be even the British, and they're arriving to the North America at the time, and how they were changing the land by taking it from Native Americans and then using it for whatever they wanted to use it for. So if you wanted to talk about all of those different features, or if you want to talk about one of those different features, you needed to explain how they did those events, or what event specifically. If you wanted to use your timeline, you can use that as a resource to explain how things changed in the Southeast and how a decision from then, so maybe for example the cotton gin, how it changed the Southeast because then it helped make things faster, make things more efficient. Once you're done with that, go ahead and make sure you have at least 3 to 4 sentences for page 119. If you need to use the essential question area, you can go ahead and do that too. But that is the end of this week's video, or this lesson's video. And then we're going to be working on 3.4 after this, or 3.3 after this. So make sure that you have completed all of this before you continue to the next lesson. I will see you in our next video.